So tonight I want to work from a classic Sufi text from Muhammad al-Ghazali, a text written very late in his life, kind of boiling down of one of his great works into a smaller, more popular Persian work, The Alchemy of Happiness. Sada, happiness, kimia, al-kimia, definite article, and then kimia, alchemy. And I'm using a translation, an old translation by Claude Field, which is actually from the Urdu. But it's still considered fairly decent if incomplete. There are some pieces that he tended to leave out. But it makes for a good accessible version in English, even if the language is still a bit old. So I'll do my best to drop the patriarchal language as I go through it, and it's to be remembered that it is a medieval text. It doesn't necessarily represent our values today, and the idea is not to accept it wholesale, but to engage with it and to enter into a relationship with the text and discern what is accidental from what is essential, what things belong to the time and what things are timeless. So in the introduction he writes, "Know, O beloved, that we were not created in jest or at random, but are marvelously made and for some great end. Although we are not everlasting, yet we live forever. And though our body is earthly, yet our spirit is lofty and divine. When in the crucible of abstinence we are purged of carnal passions, we attain to the highest, and in place of being a slave to lust and anger, become endowed with angelic qualities. Attaining that state, we find our heaven in the contemplation of eternal beauty, and no longer in the flesh. The spiritual alchemy which operates this change in us, like that which transmutes base metals into gold, is not easily discovered, nor to be found in the house of every old woman," which is to say, it's not common. "It is to explain that alchemy and its methods of operation that the author has undertaken this work, which he has entitled The Alchemy of Happiness. Now the treasuries of God in which this alchemy is to be sought are the hearts of the prophets, and one who seeks it elsewhere will be disappointed and bankrupt on the day of judgment, hearing the word, 'We have lifted the veil from off you, and your sight today is keen.' God has sent on earth 124,000 prophets." That's the standard number from the tradition, that there are 124,000 prophets, only a few of which are actually mentioned in the Quran. 124,000 prophets to teach us the prescription of this alchemy and how to purify our hearts from baser qualities in the crucible of abstinence. This alchemy may be briefly described as turning away from the world to God, and its constituents are four. 1, the knowledge of self. 2, the knowledge of God. 3, the knowledge of this world as it really is. 4, the knowledge of the next world as it really is. We shall now proceed to expound these four constituents in order. Why should he mention the 124,000 prophets? And why even say the treasuries of God, that hold this alchemy, are sought in the hearts of the prophets and not just mention The Prophet Muhammad. It's accessible to anyone. He's a teacher of Islamic theology. He's the most famous teacher of Islamic theology in his day. You would expect him to elevate the Prophet Muhammad above the others and speak about him as the Khatam al-Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets, as is often done. And he doesn't do that at all. He says this treasury is found in the hearts of the prophets, plural, and then he mentions that there are 124,000 of them sent throughout human history to all regions of the planet, to all peoples of the planet. So I think you're right. He wants to emphasize the accessibility of this alchemy, that it's not privileged to those who are Muslim. He certainly doesn't want to get away from that. He's truly a Muslim, but wants to say it's more widely available. The channel through which it comes is not as narrow as some theologians would want you to believe. And he'll come back to this. So the first chapter, the knowledge of self. Knowledge of self is the key to the knowledge of God, according to the saying, a hadith of the Prophet. To know oneself is to know God. A number of Sufi masters make this the center of different treatises. One of the most famous non-dual texts in the Sufi tradition by Ibn al-Arabi takes this as its basis. To know oneself is to know God. And as it is written in the Quran, we will show them our signs, our ayat, in the world and in themselves, that the truth may be manifest to them. We will show them our signs in the world and in themselves, that the truth may be manifest to them. The Quran is constantly pointing out signs, ayat. And it will make these kind of oath statements like, by the tree of the field or by the mountain, of God, I swear that this is true, And it sounds a little strange to us, to make this kind of oath statement, by that grand majestic tree, I say this. But actually it's rather profound. Because what was really being said is that just look around you. Everything that you're looking at is a testimony of God's grace and bounty. This tree is evidence of the divine. Look at it, really look at it. You look closely and you see divinity is everywhere because you can feel it. So he's basically, when the Quran comes out with this kind of statement, it's just saying, just look. By that mountain, I testify that this is true. And if you were to open your eyes and to look with sacred eyes, you would see the divinity is present everywhere. And so it says, we will show them our ayat, our signs, the signs of us, of divinity, in the world. They're all there. And in themselves, the signs of divinity are in you too, that the truth may be manifest to them. Now he says, nothing is nearer to you than yourself. And if you do not know yourself, how can you know anything else? It's through this being that we have a relationship with the world. If you say, I know myself, meaning your outward shape, your body, face, limbs, and so forth, such knowledge can never be the key to the knowledge of God. Nor if your knowledge as to that which is within only extends so far that you are hungry and that you eat, that you are angry and you attack, then you will progress no further in this path. Because the beasts are your partners in this, animals. But real self-knowledge consists in knowing the following things. What are you in yourself? Think about that. I mean, almost close your eyes. It's not your body. It's not your hunger. It's not your desires. What are you in yourself? He's asking it as a meditation. It almost stops you. What are you in yourself? And mostly we don't know the answer. But there's a presence of being around it and a kind of holy ignorance that is the beginning of wisdom. What he wants to point out. We're used to saying, I am. I am this body. I am this appearance. Now if you ask, what are you in yourself? It's more difficult. And all you can do is stay present to it. Then, like a Zen master, he says, where have you come from? Where have you come from? There are immediate answers, and then there are deep answers. And the deep answer leads to an unknowing also. Where are you going? What is your purpose? He says it's in this way that we begin to know ourselves. In what is your real happiness? What does your happiness and misery consist of? Some of your attributes are those of animals, some of devils, some of angels, and you have to find out which of these attributes are accidental and which are essential. There are habits that you've picked up. There are things that are essential to your being. And you don't necessarily know the difference. Find out. Begin to find out. Until you know this, you can't find out where your real happiness lies. So you know which things about yourself are accidental, changeable, habitual, and which things are essential. The occupation of animals is eating, sleeping, and fighting. Therefore, if you're an animal, busy yourself with these things. Devils are busy in stirring up mischief and in guile and deceit. If you belong to them, do their work. Angels contemplate the beauty of God and are entirely free from animal qualities. If you are of an angelic nature, then strive toward your origin, that you may know and contemplate the Most High and be delivered from the thraldom of lust and anger. You should also discover why you've been created with these two animal instincts, desire and anger. Whether that they should subdue and lead you captive, or whether that you should subdue them, and in your upward progress, Make of one your steed and the other your weapon. He's mixing there too. Make of one your steed and the other your weapon. He's talking about desire and anger, but he's also talking about the body as a steed and the emotions as a weapon, a tool. I wonder, though, if the distinctions are correct, You're made up of animal, devil, and angelic qualities. Animal qualities, negative qualities, and these angelic qualities. And he's asking us to identify with one of the three. And, this is where it shows itself to be a medieval text. Because this is in a period where the upper limits of spirituality are characterized by a divorce of matter and spirit. It's in a paradigm where matter and spirit are heavily divorced. We see it really from roughly the 1st century well into 1600s as we come into the Renaissance period and a humanist period. But for all those centuries, most spiritual texts across civilizations emphasize a kind of divorce of matter and spirit. Almost, as they put it, mortifying the flesh, almost killing the body to release the angelic spirit. It's not necessarily where we are today, or would even want to be today, because that's also a divorce from the feminine, and we paid for it. But it was part of that teaching of that time. So when he says, angels contemplate the beauty of God and are entirely free from animal qualities, if you are of an angelic nature, then strive toward that origin. When will we be ever divorced from our animal qualities? Unless we actually make some sort of divorce from the body and try to de-emphasize it to a level where it no longer impacts us. And the only point at which I can think it would no longer impact us is when we're dead.
What year was he? What context is he?
This text is probably, I think, from around 1105, and it's shortly before he dies.
Yeah.
No.
Nothing about Buddhist influences in his speech.
And there was Buddhist influence in the region where he learned his Sufism, among the group that we call the Huajigan. And we know that they were in some sort of dialogue or had some sort of connection to Buddhist monasteries that still existed then in Central Asia before they eventually disappeared or were wiped out. But that characterizes Christian thought, Jewish thought of the period, Buddhist thought. It's everywhere. So, he's asking us to identify with these angelic qualities and de-emphasize our bodies. But in some ways, it's not a realistic path. Not if you're going to continue to live in the body. So there's a difficult tension there, especially for us today in looking at this. Not that the basic ideas are wrong, but I think we have to think about tempering them with a true respect for the body and our own inner animal. The idea of the soul and its steed is maybe a good one. And he comes back to this and balances this a little bit. The first step to self-knowledge is to know that you are composed of an outward shape, called the body, and an inward entity called the heart, or soul. Heart, or soul, creating a parallel between these two. By heart, I don't mean the flesh that's situated inside the left of your body. Bless you. But that which uses all the other faculties as its instruments and servants. So, not the fleshly heart, but that which uses all the other faculties, the senses, emotions, thinking, sensation, as its servants. In truth, it does not belong to the visible world at all, but to the invisible, and has come into this world as a traveler who visits a foreign country for the sake of purchasing merchandise, and will presently return to its native land. It is the knowledge of this entity, the heart, and its attributes, which is the key to the knowledge of God. So in the medieval period, they didn't assume that the mind or the center of one's being was in the head, that it was somehow parallel to the brain and its functions. Across medieval texts, the assumption was the center of one's being and one's mind, as it were, not one's brain, not one's intellect, one's mind, was located in the heart. And not the heart of flesh, but some sort of internal subtle organ in the center of one's being that organized consciousness and made the decisions, where we put it all together. And it was right here. Over time, we left that orientation and put it in the mind. So much so that today it's very reductive. Everything has been reduced to some sort of activity of the brain among many people. But in this period, they want to say, yeah, the intellect is functioning, and they were aware that, there was a brain up here and it had an intellect. But they didn't think that's where the mind was. That the human being was a concatenation that had at its center some sort of organizing quality. It also wants to make a distinction between what you might call the surface heart and the deep heart. And they considered it an important distinction because the surface heart, and we talk this way, follow your heart, when my heart says. And often, when we're saying that, we're often talking about, in common parlance, the surface heart, meaning the emotional heart. The heart that often, I see you doubting already. The surface heart that beats fast for a lover, that gets upset in a particular situation and knows it doesn't like that. And we mean that too. That's an indicator of something. But it's the surface heart, it's the emotional heart. It's very changeable. If we were to follow that heart, we just run, from one trouble to another. Because what it's indicative of is an emotional reaction. It's not necessarily indicating the place we need to be. It's just showing us how we're reacting to a given moment. It's good information. And so the deeper wisdom around following one's heart refers to the deep heart. Not the one that beats very fast in a given moment because it's upset or because it's in love, but there's a deeper relationship to the heart that has a beat that is slower, deeper. It's something that we connect with in odd moments when we get silent and remember what our true purpose is, that we're on task. And it's kind of like our baseline. Not to say that there's not a beat there, but it's a slow beat. It's more consistent, more constant. And around that, the surface heart is sending up, many peaks and troughs along, over and above and below that. But if we listen deeper, listen more closely, listen in the silence, we'll hear the deep beat. Paulo Coelho in The Alchemist, good for talking about the alchemy of happiness, tries to illustrate this in his story, of the young man who's got the vision of where the hidden treasure lies. And he's having to do the work of discernment as he goes on this long journey, and he's following his heart. And sometimes he follows the heart that's just beating fast and is quickened in a moment, and he finds that leads him astray. And he learns to discern between that heart and that deep heartbeat that over time leads him back to the hidden treasure. And that story is actually a good illustration of trying to discern what the difference is between the surface heart and the deep heart. Some idea of the reality of the heart or spirit may be obtained by closing the eyes and forgetting everything except one's individuality. Close your eyes and forget everything but your individuality. What's it leave you with?
That's a tough one, because how many billions of people, and I'm supposed to be an individual, 7 billion people, how am I so individual from anyone in this room? There's got to be another one like that.
Did anybody else feel it was a tough one?
It left me with a question, because that's what I was going to ask. They talked all about the individual in those days, because it was a different culture. And when you come into that, you're immediately in relationship to the divine, also the sacred, and the world, all creation. So that was my question. Let me know the question.
All of these questions that he's asking that are about finding the self, they tend to throw a wrench in the works. The machine's just running, we're used to it running, and each one of these just kind of throws a wrench into it and it just gums it up. Some idea of the reality of the heart or the spirit may be obtained by closing the eyes and forgetting everything except one's individuality. As if you existed in a vacuum. It can't be. It stops you. You don't exist in a vacuum. It's stopping the works of the mind so that you can experience the presence of reality in a state of unknowing. And again, that's the beginning of knowing the self. So this is, He's not trying to be logical here. He's trying to gum up the usual process that keeps us from knowing the self. You will thus also obtain a glimpse of the unending nature of that individuality. However, too close an inquiry into the essence of the soul is forbidden by the law. In the Quran it is written, "They will question you concerning the soul. Say to them, the soul comes by the command of my sustainer." There's a limit to what we can know. This much is known of it, that it is an indivisible essence belonging to the world of decrees, meaning, and God said, God created it, and that it is not from everlasting, but created. Now, something has to be said about this. Al-Ghazali has to do a lot of work that other Sufis don't. Ibn Arabi wouldn't make this distinction. Not so much, not the way Al-Ghazali is making it. Al-Ghazali, as I mentioned before, is, was like the most famous college professor of his day, and would lecture to packed houses, there would be 200 and 300 in attendance, and he would give these lectures. And was going on like that, and was quite famous even in his youth. But the more it seemed that he knew, and the more people projected on him that he had all the answers, the less comfortable he was with himself. Until it got to a point where his own unanswered questions were just staring him in the face, and he developed a speech impediment. And he could no longer lecture the way he had, and so his egoic self started to break down. His whole idea of who he was in the world started to break down, and he began to search for different answers. So he explored all these different philosophical schools, and finally ends up looking into Sufism, which his brother had gotten into, Ahmed al-Ghazali, the great founder of the school of love in Sufism. But Muhammad al-Ghazali here ends up leaving his university position, and for like 20 years goes off into the wilderness pursuing Sufism with a Sufi master, and following his master around, leaves it all behind. And then when he's in his late 40s or early 50s, he's sent back into the world with a task. Because it's in this period that Sufism is in danger from the religious authorities who are starting to persecute Sufis. And his task is to make a kind of apology for Sufism. I don't mean like to say I'm sorry, but apology in the sense of making it palatable and acceptable so that, from a theological standpoint, so that the Sufis are not persecuted. And so he comes back and now writes these brilliant theological works that are suffused with Sufi values, and he shows how they're acceptable in the tradition. And in this way, provides safety for many generations of Sufis afterward. So in most of his works, he's being diplomatic and running a line where he's trying to present the more easily misunderstood ideas of Sufism, or the ones that would seem like heresy, in a very palatable fashion. So where Ibn Arabi would make it very clear that the soul of the human being is not different from divinity itself. Al-Ghazali is not going to say that. On the other hand, he also believes that. So he wants to talk about a penultimate category that also exists. That there's a level of identity between the soul and divinity, and in fact, everything in divinity, where you can't even say "and divinity." But here he wants to deal with another aspect of ourselves, which you might think of as kind of maybe a series of archetypes of being, archetypes of the human being. Like, there's a Wajid, there's a Merlin, there's an Emily, there's a Netanel, that are not the things in life that have happened to us and the decisions that we've made that have shaped how we express right now. The anxiety that I grew up with that created me to be afraid of speaking in public, and then having to overcome all of that. Wipe all that away, and there's some sort of primary archetype of this being that really exists in potential. And just allow it to exist in potential. It's not yet shaped by anything in life, but it's all of these potentials. And those potentials have limits, This body is probably not going to grow beyond certain dimensions. It's always going to be kind of slim. Probably not going to grow beyond a certain height, but based on nutrition, etc., and various other factors, I'll be this tall or this tall. And certain kind of mental capacity, various other things. But clean out all the decisions that got made, all the nutrition or lack thereof, and all that, get back there. And there's kind of an archetype of what Wajid might be, what I might be. And that's fascinating to think about. There was an early psychotherapist, George Kelly, who was talking about constructive alternativism.
Is this in the mode of before you come to Earth, there's an archetypical being that's coming down and embodying this body?
That's what's being suggested here.
Okay.
Kelly was talking about psychologically that we get ourselves into tracks. Because we've made certain decisions at certain points in our lives, we believe this is the way life is. Right now, I arrived here, this is where I am. And I feel like that everything in the past is completely finished. And he would ask us to say, what if? Just because the archetype of Netanel made that decision in life at 20 years old that brought him here, an alternate decision exists still in the archetype. And what if I were to now get fluid with my being as it exists right now, let go of all the fixed ideas of who I am based on that decision, and now operate as if I can still execute that other possibility? And Kelly would want to say, and you can. That it's an alternate route that we exclude because we've so fixed on what the decisions we have made. He says, but in the archetype of our being, it's still possible. And so if we loosen up, we back up to our infinite potential, to our potential being, we can make a different kind of decision and move in a different direction. We're not trapped in this trajectory. We can take a new trajectory. But it requires stepping back out of the fixedness of our life right now.
You're talking about parallel universes?
Almost. At least backing into the reality structures of another universal possibility. Very much the way Rupert Sheldrake was talking about, that there are no laws of nature, there are habits of nature. So if we step back out of the habitual nature and realize things are more fluid, then we can participate in an alternate universe even right here.
My question is with him, there was also, in the early days, fatalism, that you have to, no matter what decision you make, you're gonna end up at this fate
Mm-hmm.
that you're born with, or under the star, or whatever, came from astrology mostly, but what about DNA in that, or character? Even a child, when they're born, they're an infant, you can almost feel there's a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the character is fine with this definition. It's just the decisions that get made for that character and by that character have so much to do with circumstance.
That I understand.
Yeah.
That's like what I call original sin, that we're born into this and you can't get it, and that's what you have to deal with for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Just by being a certain gender, and then all of a sudden, if you're not a certain gender, what happens,
Mm-hmm.
in this world and that type of thing.
What he wants to say here is that, okay, we have the primordial archetype of Arthur before he has a name, and even the name affects you. And then deeper than that, deeper than that soul is a primordial human. And that primordial human archetype has another way of reflecting divinity. So these are just sheaths of identity. So right now he's staying close to the primordial archetype of the individual, and then the deeper one of the human being. Because if he goes deeper to divinity, then he's going to run into theological trouble. But this already takes us very deep and gets us out of fixed ways of operating and takes us more to unknowing, which is where he wants us to go.
So does he say that it's mortal?
He says that it's created.
Okay, and then what happens? Yeah.
Yeah. It exists with God, and as long as God exists, it exists.
So it's the beginning.
An exact philosophical knowledge of the soul is not a necessary preliminary to walking in the path of religion, but comes rather as a result of self-discipline and perseverance in that path. As it is said in the Quran, those who strive in our way, verily, truly, we will guide them to the right paths. So it's wondering about your soul is not a necessary for the basics of religion that Islam wants to set forward. Islam wants to say, do this, and it will work out for you. Now we're talking about Sufism, which actually wants to ask deeper questions. So he says, this is not about religion so much. For the carrying on of this spiritual warfare, by which the knowledge of oneself and of God is to be obtained, the body should be figured or conceived of as a kingdom or a sovereignty, and the soul as its sovereign. The different senses and faculties as the army of the king, the sovereign. Reason can be called the vizier or prime minister. Passion, the revenue collector, the one who gathers all the goods of the kingdom. And anger, its police officer. Problem is, under the guise of collecting revenue, passion is continually prone to plundering on its own account. And anger or resentment is always inclined to harshness and extreme severity. Both of these, the revenue collector and the police officer, have to be kept in due subordination to the sovereign, but not gotten rid of, as they have their own proper functions to fulfill. But if passion and resentment master reason, the ruin of the soul infallibly ensues. A soul which allows its lower faculties to dominate the higher is as one who should hand over an angel to the power of a dog, or a Muslim to the tyranny of an unbeliever. Muslim, again, meaning one who surrenders, one who is surrendered to God. The cultivation of demonic, animal, or angelic qualities results in the production of corresponding characters, which in the day of judgment, the Yom Adin, the day of reckoning, will be manifested in visible shapes in the imaginal realm, as it were. The sensual appearing as a pig, as a swine, the ferocious character as a dog or a wolf, and the pure as angels. The aim of moral discipline is to purify the heart from the rust or passion and resentment, till like a clear mirror it reflects the light of God. Now we get that traditional Sufi image, the mirror of the heart, which acquires the accretions and grime and different things that keep it from being a clear reflection of reality. The various things that happen to us and distortions of what we truly are act like grime on the mirror, and we can't reflect what reality as it is. We have a warped sense of things, a distorted sense of things. So part of asking those questions is to start to wipe away the grime. Someone may here object, but if we've been created with animal and demonic qualities as well as angelic, how are we to know that the latter constitute our real essence, while the former are merely accidental or transitory? It's a good question. If we have these qualities, why should we privilege one over the other? Why should we think of those as not really us? And I don't know if I accept his answer completely, other than it's reasoned. We have a body. Why should we not think this body is purposeful and good, and to be used to God's ends? Not to just be transcended. To this I answer that the essence of each creature is to be sought in that which is highest in it and particular to it. Okay? So, my dog has a limbic brain, and he has emotion, but it doesn't have a reasoning faculty. Well, at least not as developed. My dog had a reasoning capacity, clearly. He was a schemer. So he wants to say, the argument of holons, that transcend and include. They come out of one thing, they evolve from one thing, but they evolve to a higher form that includes the former form. Thus, the horse and the ass are both burden-bearing animals, but the superiority of the horse to the ass consists, to his mind, in its being adapted for use in battle. Nobody rides into battle on an ass. Or they're the one way behind the battle. If it fails in this, it is degraded to the rank of a burden-bearing animal. Similarly, with the human being, the highest faculty is reason, which fits for the contemplation of God. If this predominates, then at the moment of death, we leave behind all tendencies to passion and resentment and become capable of association with animals. I would want to translate reason here. Reason feels too reductive and a little too heady. Consciousness. The capacity to make it a decision, reflexive awareness, consciousness, rather than the ability to reason. Yes, that's a capacity of the intellect, but that consciousness is not necessarily limited to that. And so if we substitute where he says reason for consciousness, I think we're closer to what he's trying to get at, even if there wasn't as good a word at the time. And I don't know what word is being translated as reason originally from the Farsi here. That would be good to know also. As regards our mere animal qualities, we are inferior to many animals. But in consciousness, we are superior to them. As it is written in the Quran, to the human being we have subjected all things in the earth. We have this capacity. And with it, it's not to say that we also haven't done damage with it. The failure to use the fullness of the capacity of consciousness has also led to the destruction of much of the planet. To take full cognizance and keep full awareness of our own embeddedness in ecological systems, So that sense, the sense of superiority instead of the use of the superior function is also a means of our destruction. But if our lower tendencies triumph, after death, we will be looking toward the earth and longing for earthly delights. Now the rational soul, or the decision-making soul, or consciousness, abounds in marvels, both of knowledge and power. By means of it, we master arts and sciences, can pass in a flash from earth to heaven and back again. Little did he know. Or maybe he did. We can map the skies and measure the distances between stars. By it also, we can draw the fish from the sea and the bird from the air, and can subdue our animals, service animals, like an elephant, or the camel, or the horse. Our 5 senses are like 5 doors opening on the external world. But more wonderful than this, the heart has a window which opens on the unseen world of spirits. I love the way he's talking right now, what the 5 senses opening like doors on the external world. I mean, even in 1105, he sounds, far more intelligent than most of the people you meet on the street. Just in the awareness, thinking about what it is to be human. Most humans just don't even think about what it is to be human. Just trapped in patterns that are hardly better than animal patterns, without a sense of the nobility of their being, the capacity and the beauty of this body and essence. But more wonderful than this, the heart has a window which opens on the unseen world of spirits. In the state of sleep, when the avenues of the senses are closed, this window is opened, and we receive impressions from the unseen world, and sometimes foreshadowings of the future. This heart is then like a mirror which reflects that which is pictured in the tablet of fate. But even in sleep, thoughts of worldly things dull this mirror, so that the impressions it receives are not clear. So again, we make distinctions between the types of dreams we have. Dreams that are processing sensory impressions from the day. Dreams, we know we have types of dreams that are basically scenarios that help us refine our actions, our future actions. So we run scenarios as like reality testing, or like a virtual environment, so that we know we sharpen our reactions in the future. And then we have dreams that seem to be something else entirely, that come from the deep unconscious and show us things for which we can't account. And the only way of accounting is to say that in that some level of our dreams participate in the unconscious, which is not limited by temporal and spatial relations, that other kinds of information can come through it. And this is part of the capacity of the human being too. After death, however, such thoughts vanish and things are seen in their naked reality, those thoughts that are obscuring. And the saying in the Quran is fulfilled, "We have stripped the veil from off you, and today your sight is keen." Like Paul says in the New Testament, now we but see through a glass darkly, a spaklaria. But then we shall see as we are seen. We'll see clearly then. This opening of a window in the heart toward the unseen also takes place in conditions approaching those of prophetic inspiration. So now we're getting back to why he was widening the field of prophecy and wanting to say, it's available. Look how many people have been prophets. And he wants to come close to saying we have this capacity without suggesting that we ourselves are prophets. But opening this window of the heart takes place in conditions approaching those of prophetic inspiration, when intuitions spring up in the mind unconveyed through any sense channel. The more we purify ourselves from desires and concentrate the mind on God, the more conscious we will be of such intuitions. Learn to sift our awareness and learn what are sense impressions, what is the surface heart in its quick beating, and learn to discern the slow beating, deep heart. That's where we'll come to intuitions. Those who are not conscious of them, these intuitions, have no right to deny their reality. They can doubt them, but they can't deny it for somebody else. I mean, they can, but not with any justice.
This is why you came back, is like that statement there. Don't judge us and don't condemn us because you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So,
Yep. Nor are such intuitions confined only to those of prophetic rank. Just as iron by sufficient polishing can be made into a mirror, so any mind by due discipline can be rendered receptive of such impressions. Cleansing the mirror of the heart can give us access to the same sort of well from which the prophets have drunk. It was at this truth the prophet hinted when he said, "Every child is born with a predisposition toward Islam. Then their parents make them a Jew or a Christian or a star worshiper." But in potential, and this is also Islamic theology, that everyone is born a Muslim. There are no converts to Islam. There are only reverts. There's no conversion, there's reversion. Because Islam means the surrender, and a Muslim is one who is surrendered, no one is more surrendered than a human child, born completely helpless. And therefore they see every child is born a Muslim. And it's only their parents that make them something else. But deeper than that, he's wanting to point out, deeper than that kind of, very literal sort of interpretation, he's wanting to say, like Hazrat Inayat Khan says, about the child that's born like a photographic plate, very vulnerable to impressions, and therefore in many societies, the child used to be very, very carefully protected from impressions. You would only you might not come out of your teepee for a month with your child. And the people invited in to help you with your child would be very carefully selected for their character, because anybody who's going to touch or handle your child is going to leave impressions on them. And so that used to be something that earlier societies were very, very careful about. Now everybody wants to hold your baby, but he's wanting to say, we come in very, very fresh, very, very surrendered, very, very open. We come in as Muslims, surrendered. And we, because we're so open, kind of a prophetic flow is really just running through us. We're very close to that flow. And it gets warped, it gets covered over by the impressions that we then acquire. And then we have to go through a process after we've reached adulthood of then wiping away those impressions so we can get back to where we once were. Go through a process of unlearning. Every human being has in the depths of their consciousness heard the question, "Am I not your sustainer?" The question that Allah asks, and answered, "Yes." But some hearts are like mirrors so befouled with rust and dirt, grime, that they give no clear reflections anymore. While those of the prophets and saints, though they are human beings of like passions with us, are extremely sensitive to all divine impressions. Now, he's in some sense leaping ahead to where Ibn Arabi goes when he opens up the whole idea of prophecy. And he has to deal with the theological statement that is accepted in Islam that the Prophet Muhammad is the last and the greatest of the prophets. Now that doesn't seem to be what the Quran was actually suggesting when it called the Prophet Muhammad the seal of the prophets. What the language seems to be suggesting, according to historians of religion, is that statement, seal of the prophets, meant that he had the seal of authenticity. That he was a real prophet. Not that he was the end of prophecy. But Islamic theology later takes it to mean that the prophecy ends. And when that theological statement is so strong, there's no getting around it anymore. So along comes, the great Ibn Arabi, the Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest of the Sufi sheikhs. And he begins to talk about, after the Prophet Muhammad, we no longer have prophets, but we have awliya, the friends of God, saints. And sainthood is actually superior to prophecy in some sense, or rather prior, because can you imagine having a prophet who wasn't first a saint, and out of the sainthood then opened up to the prophetic capacity, or God designated that saint to be a prophet. So the sainthood was prior. and so in some sense, a necessary first step that allows one to be a prophet. And since there are no longer any more prophets, there are still saints. And through saints come the same sort of prophetic inspiration, if not new messages that God is sending down. But the same flow of prophecy is flowing through them. It's a workaround. Maybe I'm being judgmental in saying that also. Nor is it only by reason of knowledge acquired and intuitive that the soul of the human being holds the first rank among created things, but also by reason of power. Just as angels preside over the elements, so does the soul rule over the members of the body. Those souls which attain a special degree of power not only rule their own body, but those of others also. Now here we're not talking about sainthood, we're talking about a very, very developed disciplined capacity. If they wish a person to recover, if they wish a sick person to recover, that sick person recovers. If they wish someone to fall ill, that person becomes ill. If they will the presence of a person, that person comes to them. According as the effects produced by these powerful souls are good or bad, they are termed miracles or sorceries. These souls differ from common folk in three ways. One, what others only see in dreams, they see in their waking moments. They live a mythological reality, as it were. Two, while others' wills only affect their own bodies, these, by their willpower, can move bodies extraneous to themselves. Three, the power which others acquire by laborious learning comes to them by intuition. So, in some ways, this is bearing out what is said in the yoga tradition, that certain disciplined practice, certain disciplined meditative practice leads to siddhis, attainments that seem supernatural, beyond the usual capacities. And in that tradition, they would say, and these are the biggest ego traps yet, to have such attainments. And so here it's clearly putting these kinds of things that come from disciplined contemplative effort into a power category that can be abused or can just be a natural outgrowth of a deeply aware and disciplined person that they learn not to use in a power dynamic in a manner that does harm. These three, of course, are not the only marks which differentiate them from common people, but the only ones that come within our cognizance. Just as no one knows the real nature of God but God, so no one knows the real nature of a prophet but a prophet. Nor is this to be wondered at, as in everyday matters we see that it is impossible to explain the charm of poetry to one whose ear is insusceptible to it, or the glories of color to one who is blind. And besides mere incapacity, and that's to say a lesser thing can't understand a greater thing. Which sometimes makes me wonder about biographies. Somebody writes a biography of a genius. Do they ever get it right or even come close? One of these is externally acquired knowledge. To use a figure, the heart may be represented as a well, and the five senses as five streams which are continuously conveying water to that well. In order to find out the real contents of the heart well, these streams must be stopped for a time. Streams of the senses. It must be stopped for a time, at any rate, and the refuse they have brought with them must be cleared out of the well. To see what kind of water is coming up, from the spring underneath it. What is that in itself, without the streams from the senses coming into it and possibly polluting it? And so we have to cut off the streams of the senses. And that's what we're doing in a disciplined meditative process. Stilling the body. And we know if we hold it still enough for long enough, the pressure sense turns off, and we get a monolithic sensation of the body. It just feels like it could just a rock. It's just like a resin form that's been poured. And that allows us to have more interior awareness. So withdrawing the senses, which is one of the 8 limbs of yoga, withdrawing the senses inward. So only when we stop those for a while can we have some sense of what's going on inside without their influence. In other words, we are to arrive at pure spiritual truth, and to do so we must put away for the time knowledge which has been acquired by external processes and which too often hardens into dogmatic prejudice. A mistake of an opposite kind is made by shallow people who, echoing some phrases they've heard from Sufis, go about criticizing all knowledge. This is as if a person who was not an adept in alchemy were to go about saying alchemy is better than gold and then refused gold when it's offered to them. Alchemy is better than gold, but real alchemists are rare, as are real Sufis. One who has a mere smattering of Sufism is not superior to the learned person, any more than one who has tried a few experiments in alchemy has grounds for despising the rich. Anyone who will look into the matter will see that happiness is necessarily linked with the knowledge of God. Each faculty of ours delights in that for which it was created. Desire delights in accomplishing desire, anger in taking vengeance, the eye in seeing beautiful objects, the ear in hearing harmonious sounds. The highest function of the soul is the perception of truth, Hak. In this, accordingly, it finds its special delight. I think that's what we're thinking about. The highest function in us, the highest function of the soul, is the perception of truth.
Perception?
The capacity for being aware of truth. In this it finds its special delight. The soul delights in the awareness of truth. Even in trifling matters such as learning chess, this holds good. And the higher the subject matter of the knowledge obtained, the greater the delight. A person would be pleased at being admitted into the confidence of a prime minister, but how much more so if the king made them an intimate? Depending on the king. An astronomer who, by their knowledge, can map the stars and describe their courses, derives more pleasure from this knowledge than perhaps the chess master from theirs. Seeing then that nothing is higher than God, how great must be the delight which springs from the true knowledge of God. A person in whom the desire for this knowledge has disappeared is like one who has lost their appetite for healthy food and prefers clay to bread. All bodily appetites perish at death with the organs they use, but the soul dies not and retains whatever knowledge of God it possesses. And nay, that increases. An important part of our knowledge of God arises from the study and contemplation of our own bodies, which reveal to us the power, wisdom, and love of the Creator. Now we're going back to the ayat, the signs of divinity in ourselves. God's power, in that from a mere drop, has built up this wonderful frame of the human being. God's wisdom is revealed in its intricacies and the mutual adaptability of its parts. And God's love is shown not only by supplying organs as absolutely necessary for existence, as the liver, the heart, and the brain, but those which are not absolutely necessary, the hand, the foot, the tongue, and the eye. I find them somewhat necessary. To these, God has added as ornaments the blackness of the hair, the redness of lips, and the curve of the eyebrows. Somebody lives in a culture where everybody has black hair. I think by suggesting that the hands and the feet and the eyes are not necessary, I think he's more pointing out how wonderful it is that they can be used to bring sustenance back to the internal organs. You can live, yeah. Yeah. The human being has been truly termed a microcosm, a little world, and the structure of this body should be studied not only by those who wish to become doctors, but by those who wish to attain a more intimate knowledge of God. Just as close study of the niceties and shades of language in a great poem reveals more and more of the genius of its author. But when all is said, the knowledge of the soul plays a more important part in leading to the knowledge of God than the knowledge of our body and the functions. The body may be compared to a steed and the soul to its rider. The body was created for the soul and the soul for the body. Rider and steed, it takes you somewhere. You need it. If a person knows not their own soul, which is the nearest thing to them, the deepest thing in them, what is the use, or by what right do you claim to know anyone else or anything else? It is as if a beggar who has not the wherewithal for a meal should claim to be able to feed a town. In this chapter, we've attempted in some degree to expound the greatness of the human being. A person who neglects it and suffers its capacities to rust or degenerate must necessarily be the loser in this world and the next. The true greatness of the human being lies in the capacity for eternal progress. Otherwise, in this temporal sphere, one is the weakest of all things, being subject to hunger, thirst, heat, cold, and sorrow. Those things we take most delight in are often the most injurious to us. And those things which benefit us are not to be obtained without toil and trouble. As to our intellect, a slight disarrangement of matter in the brain is sufficient to destroy or madden us. As to our power, the sting of a wasp is sufficient to rob us of ease and sleep. As to our temper, we are upset by the loss of a sixpence. I don't know what the coin is here in translation. As to our beauty, we are little more than matter covered with soft skin. Without frequent washing, we become utterly repulsive and disgraceful. In truth, the human being in this world is extremely weak. It is only in the next that we will be of value. A questionable statement to me. If by means of the alchemy of happiness, we rise from the rank of beasts to that of angels. Otherwise, our condition will be worse than the brutes, which perish and turn to dust. It is necessary for us at the same time that we are conscious of our superiority as the climax of created things, to learn also to know our own helplessness, as that too is one of the keys to the knowledge of God. So that's the knowledge of the self, and the next chapter is, of course, the knowledge of God.